Okay, let's see. Okie doke. So this is prep for Wednesday next week, and today's the 15th, and trying to get ahead of this. This is uh, Gabriel Rockhill's a book. It's the conclusion to it. It's I suppose it's a magnum opus of one kind, volume one. Um, and Who paid the pipers? It's it's a text on what one might refer to as the leftist culture industry, and it is a not so much a screed, but it it makes a particular point about post-war leftism and Western Marxism and the divergence between what is a the actual dominant stream of actual Marxism, which is an anti-imperialist Marxism and not the sort of Western or cultural Marxism. And it's a reasonable argument. I don't disagree with it. I think it has other manifestations, and I don't particularly buy the overall argument that somehow cultural Marxism got co-opted by the intelligence community. Uh, I mean, it's clear that there was, you know, uh, national interest and certainly overlaps with that with the intelligence community, considering the anti-communism that has existed, in the last century and continues to this day. But I don't think it's quite as linear, and it's worse. Uh, I mean, the real problematic elements are ones that Rockhill is fully engaged in. Runs here. Um, Wrote with Althusser, and he knows all this stuff. So I don't have a particular problem with that. I do have a problem with trying to um, and I don't think it's really demonizing Western Marxism and a variety of other variants that come from that, because in some ways it was a very necessary feature of post-war um, academia to, and it was because of a certain kind of overproduction of academics. I don't want to get down to a kind of determinist argument, but some academic departments got too big, and it's just simply demographic. It's the GI Bill. I mean, from an American point of view, that the academy got bigger, and on the one hand, it was important that it did, and the scale allowed for the expansion of a variety of alternative perspectives, and it was I think in a Marxian way, you can analyze this. So the political economy of it is that there was overproduction of the academy in terms of um, too many people with advanced degrees. There were more students, which was a part of that. And then now there's some contraction that is partially due to anti-intellectualism and a variety of other things. But I don't, I mean, I think it's just too easy to refer to it as a simple division, and I don't think it's simplistic, but I do think that, and I'm not being an apologist for imperial the imperial superstructure of academia, but it just, it did evolve that way. And uh, on the one hand, the intelligence apparatus of the state, used varieties of it, but on the other hand, it just simply grew for a whole variety of other reasons. And I don't want to get too far into it, but and if you've been following what I've been looking at, the Japanese version of post-war Marxism is uh, different and uh, perhaps not as problematic. And of course, if you follow the sort of the academic history of um, or the development of the Marxism and the People's Republic, you can see that there was some clear divisions that were primarily linguistic. I mean, in the sense of uh, people in the People's Republic weren't looking at American things or English things, British things for a variety of reasons, and tended to look at French stuff. But their version of what looking at French stuff never really quite got into the heavy duty stuff, and particularly in the divergence or intersections of what was important or not so important in that context. So I just find it a little too easy to, and but even though I agree with the critique of Western Marxism as being sort of uh, not imperial in that particular sense, and you can do it that way, but in fact there's a kind of you have to actually look at it directly. So there's that. And so I'm going to go through this, and by the time I get to the end of this, you'll see, and it's not very long, conclusion to Paying the Piper, the book, Paying the Piper Volume 1. Um, but and I think it's concise, which is why I chose it, because I tend to think that there is, there's a kind of discretion, um, a diverging kind of element that occurs in this discourse that is okay, fine. I have no problem with it. I just think that you shouldn't say that it's completely bogus or reactionary or whatever, and that because it follows the same argument that we're looking at with uh, last week, Lauson's text on Marxism, and I think that it's better to think of this as a evolutionary problem and not quite so easily divided. And on the other hand, I wouldn't go giving so much support to uh, what has often been a kind of problematic development of orthodox, however you want to define it, pure anti-imperialist Marxism, because it wasn't so pure, and it had a lot of contradictory elements that made it more difficult uh, to sort of reconcile the conflicts. And as I say, I think if you look at certain types of history that that aren't Western Marxism, but evolved in a way that you could probably tar it with the same brush, like for example Japanese Marxism. Um, and I don't think you should do it identically, clearly, but there are divergences that I would assert are being reconciled, much as the academic elements of it, the dominance of certain Russian approaches to translating Marx, um, and the fact of not fully integrating or misunderstanding perhaps certain Marxian things and it may have been they're all kind of the war was waged at primarily an academic level, but I would assert that uh, it's not as it's not as clear cut, I think, as he tries to define it. Although I appreciate his doing it that way because that allows us to say, okay, you know, mistakes have been made, uh, and they're really problematic when you think of, the kind of history, the history of ideas in post-war Western Marxism. But I think it's you know just because it's all bourgeois doesn't make it quite so bad. Particularly since those people are actually some of the most important people um, relative to political economy. I mean, the pure elements of Marxist political economy have a much more varied and important class background, and that's, I think, the historiography I think needs to be worked through a little bit more. And so I think that when you assert a radical history and a anti-imperialist Marxism, you need to be sort of careful about how you define some things. And yes, it's easy to trash the Frankfurt School for all of the kind of reasons, but you've got to see it as an important intersection with actual, actual struggle, and look at it in that context. That is, the issues of Adorno, Marcuse, et cetera. You got to see it in a much more integrated way. I mean, without going to too far in terms of extremes, but Marcuse was, Angela Davis's professor at Brandeis, and she went with him essentially, or came to, UC San Diego when Marcuse went to UC San Diego. So in terms of the history of struggle, uh, the connection between all this academic stuff and actual class struggle is sort of still there. And yes, you could say, well, it was adventurism. It didn't fully identify its sort of class affiliations, and and it's working. But you got to see it in the context of the period. That there was anti-imperial struggle, and that it had a lot of a complex nuance, particularly those of us who are old enough to remember it. And so I think it's a little more variegated than I think he sets it up. Even though I completely agree with him, and it has this current AIM trend is important to have because it revises certain kinds of positions in history that need to be revised, that just needs to be reintegrated or seen in full context. Similarly, um, just as I would assert that, tendencies that are not purely Western Marxism, like the Japanese Marxism, for example, are uh, not given enough attention in that particular sense. And equally so, to look at, China, there are problematic strains built all the way through it. That is that on the one hand, it's a it's a country with actual Marxist universities and departments and universities and that are Marxist, purely Marxist. I mean, and that it's something to be that certainly doesn't happen in Western countries. So it's always been an uphill struggle, and Rockhill knows this. So this is nothing new. I just think that often he's so dogged, and he's got the materials to prove it, that yes, it is, the piper does get paid, and it's unfortunate, but that's history. And I think we need to sort of uh, move more quickly past that kind of set of conflicts, because it's what is important is to move forward and to look at more, as they say, uh, primary or principled contradictions in that context. Anyway, So there are two paragraphs I wanted to begin with, and I'll read those when we meet on Wednesday. But I do think that they're really important ones, and they kind of define the whole bit of work. And the first one is uh, the capitalist class and the imperial superstructure have contributed to the development of the commodified version of anti-communist Marxism known as Western or cultural Marxism. And the nominating it as cultural Marxism buys into a whole other set of arguments that are not only important relative to Bolshevism, but are problematic relative, I think, to reactionary, right-wing fascist discourse. So um, I just don't want to see that cultural and Marxism brought together, even though the analysis is clearly about cultural studies, or the early version of it in terms of the Frankfurt School, and the later version of it that goes into cultural studies, etc. So anyway, severed for the most part from practical progressive political struggle. You see, I don't think it's as severed as he would claim. Anyway, it significantly alters some of the fundamental tenets of Marxism in becoming little more than a consumer product of the imperial theory industry, which is an incredibly useful trope. But, I don't know if it gets us anywhere uh, because, you know, yeah, there is an imperial theory industry, and it's not simply represented by leftists or whatever. Imperial theory industry is actually supported, as I think in the current day, by academic administrations. At least in the American context, you can see the full force of um, imperialism at work, as we've seen more recently with firing of or trashing, you know, the same things because of the attacks on quote unquote DEI, blah blah blah. Um, so I just want to be more careful because I it's easy to talk about an imperial theory industry and sort of marginalize it, and say that the new generation is doing something, plowing new ground. I don't think it is. And I think that there have always been uh, classical questions or neoclassical questions that underlie the development of heterodox Marxist political economy. So anyway, you know, I guess I should write something to prove that or to move that forward. And I do think there are other people who are working on that, and I do think that there are interesting works that overlap with that, but some of them are simply careerist elements, and I think that that's the imperial theory industry is at its very basis a whole problem of careerism and more about economic politics than it is, in fact, about ideology. Although obviously ideology is now this massive reactionary industry. Um, for example, without going too far afield, gender ideology is this thing, and it really should have never become a thing. But the fact is there was not enough resistance, and so it's now pernicious in that particular context, and quite weirdly pernicious. But it's as though certain decades got lost in the discourse. But anyway, meaning an ideologically infused commodity for the professional managerial class stratum in the imperial core and their comprador collaborators in the periphery. It seems so pat, uh, but it is there. I just think that it's not as hegemonic as, in fact, it sort of is counter hegemonic simply because it is so um, um, sort of rigidly defined in this particular way. But anyway, it's there. I don't deny its existence. It is, but I think that if you look at the full population of all those who remained in the academy, and then an entire segment that is not necessarily part of the academy, but is or is more marginalized within that context. I think that the story is a little more widely configured. Let's put it that way. So DHM, dialectical and historical materialism, DHM is firmly, this is another paragraph much further along, is firmly grounded in the primacy of practice. It is an evolving collective tradition of analyzing and intervening in the world, and it is therefore of necessity a practical process of learning. Rather than exchange value, it is use value that guides it insofar as it strives to provide the most rigorous, coherent, and systematic understanding of concrete reality and how to change it. Now, and I think it's oversimplification in this particular context from a Marxist point of view to say rather than exchange value, it is use value that guides it in so, it already bifurcates certain arguments that are much deeper and more problematic for all kinds of reasons, and that we don't have to go into here. But I think if you've been listening to the stuff that I've been looking at, you'll see that the argument is much more nuanced, particularly on the issue of what counts as classical political economy, Marx's relation to classical political economy, and the kind of revisions that have been made, and particularly the translation issues that have come up, and also the archival things that have changed. So all of that is alters what I would assert is altered. And you can't just say, oh, it's all the PMC and blah, blah, blah. There's always been a PMC. It just there's just more of it in the second half of the 20th century. What is often fetishized in imperial Marxism is theoretical innovation for its own sake, and practical Marxism is commonly denigrated for being reductivist, dogmatic, orthodox, and so forth. Well, yeah, that's one way of looking at it, but there are also people who, have tried to bridge those two elements, and I think we need to, and that may be ultimately what he's going to do in subsequent writing. I just think that because he seized on the uh, post-war and the Frankfurt School, it's kind of easy to argue from that they were co-opted or whatever. I think it is simply historical. I think in the history of the Frankfurt School, you have to look at or Adorno, Horkheimer, blah blah blah. But if you want to see that what they were building on was a very the use value oriented practical Marxism that was not altered in their, they just assumed that it was okay, that it was sort of complete, and it wasn't, or I would assert hasn't been, if you look a little bit more at the details, in terms of Sraffian, neo-Ricardian. I don't think you throw all that out. I think you can throw a lot of it out, but because it gets us into areas that are problematic. But um, you know, like the tendency of the profit to fall, blah blah blah. All those things are still part of the overall Marxian project, and do guide or make more whole the issue of those things often denigrated for being reductivist, dogmatic, orthodox, and so forth. And I if you want to seize control of the heterodox, I don't think this is the way to do it. But I do appreciate the identification of and to pick it as a trope to sort of work through, because you know, God forbid we kind of ignore what I think is useful and interesting things. But as I think you can see in other philosophical discourse that goes on and its evolution in the last 20 to 30 years, that there's a lot more going on there. And as much as it was problematic, postmodernism, blah, 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 it was important to maintain a kind of at least quasi-material or historicized discourse that underlies this, particularly with some major figures, and that's worth arguing out at the academic level, on the one hand. On the other hand, you needed to have it there in order to cope with some of the things that are the current problems. That is that the lack of cultural literacy, if you want to use it in that way, is what is slowing up or problematizing current resistance at the street level, whatever. Anyway, although there have been sometimes elements of this sort operative in particular movements, many of which have been correctly criticized and practically overcome by anti-imperialist Marxists, the expansive international history of DHM, dialectical and historical materialism, has been one characterized by significant innovations, impressive levels of creativity, highly refined and dialectical analyses, extremely perceptive, strategic, and tactical calculations, savvy practical solutions, and in general, a successful charting of uncharted territory. So, he comes to the sort of position that it's still all good. It's just that, there have been these, problematic themes or currents or alternatives that have been, obviously problematized. But, when you look at the overall intellectual history of it, they got marginalized. Marcuse got marginalized in his later years. I think one is being too selective when you sort of look at certain things, and of course the revisiting of critical theory has been actually very important. With all due respect, some things have not gotten translated into English, so that and people are working on that kind of project, and that's kind of interesting and important as well. And he knows that, and I'm not saying anything new. I just find it problematic from a different perspective, and not because it's anyway, self-criticism is necessary. Let's put it that way. All right, conclusion: imperial versus anti-imperialist Marxism are the scourge of Western Marxism. Dialectics of critique. If the designing of the future and the proclamation of ready-made solutions for all time is not our affair, then we realize all the more clearly what we have to accomplish in the present. I am speaking of a ruthless criticism of everything existing. Ruthless in two senses. The criticism must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be. And I think it's the most important way to think about, ending it. The second part of this book has been highly critical of the Frankfurt School and Western Marxism more generally. The purpose of such critique is not primarily destructive, no, but rather constructive, or rather reconstructive. And I think that's an interesting turn of phrase, because it on the one hand it is destructive, but and necessarily or ironically deconstructive in that particular case, but which is what I think that Rockhill is performing in this particular context. Now, this is the case on multiple levels. To begin with, the argument is not that we should completely disregard everything that has been written by the Frankfurt School or Western Marxists. This book has been primarily focused on its leaders and the most well-known figures, and automatically that's problematic because it has a historiographic limitation, because I think it's really the schools of that the army of graduate students that interacted with these guys that's actually more important when you see how it and not that I'm going to write something on that, but I think that you can see that, and if you look at other people who are writing on Frankfurt School stuff, I think that there's an entire body of literature that still needs to be addressed. As I just mentioned, that on the one hand, you could have all these Frankfurt School folks And their approach to political economy was, very either normal or assumed that a certain kind of, as it were, dogma or dogmatism or convention or normalcy, that sort of the normal science, Marxism's version of normal science. So I don't think they ignored it. They just assumed that it didn't need to be worked on, when in fact it really did. And what they were working on needed, the whole commodity question, needed to be reworked. And I don't think, Frankfurt School went far enough in terms of working through that problem. So anyway, back to the text. It has not provided an exhaustive account, particularly for the more marginal or left-leaning scholars, which is the point I'm making. Moreover, even if we limit ourselves to these key thinkers, which is a historiographic problem, we should learn anything that we can from them, sure, while being vigilant about the pernicious influence that they can have. Well, the perniciousness has become revised by reactionary and right-wing folks, and that's the current problem with so-called cultural Marxism being, totally, misread, misunderstood, adopted, in fact, by reactionary characters. And in fact, people who are, well, imperialists, whatever. This orientation is precisely the one found in Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so many others in this tradition, who insisted upon learning from thinkers with whom they did not agree politically, while also situating them in history and class struggle in order to shed light on their underlying presumptions. And that's all good. This process of learning is not restricted then to their internal arguments, even though I just mentioned one of the important ones in Frankfurt School, but it also includes, crucially, how they function within the social totality. So it is both things. It is, on the one hand, existing, in the ivory tower. On the other hand, it is getting out there and being in the vernacular in that sense. The task of materialist contextualization has been at the core of this book, insofar as it has examined the life and work of individual subjects, but also the objective social world within which their theoretical practices develop. Well, yes and no. This is a unique feature of dialectical hermeneutics. And of course, I'm, is much more than, I would presume to have in terms of not only the hermeneutic elements of it, but that a dialectical hermeneutics has within its own, Western Marxist context has its own sort of set of limitations. But anyway, which considers both subjective theoretical practices and objective socioeconomic conditions, as well as, more decisively, the relationship between the two, which is, I think, the more important thing. And I'm grateful that he acknowledges that. This is what has allowed us to cultivate a deeper understanding of the Frankfurt School, not simply as a group of individual thinkers or isolated texts, but as an intellectual tradition that took on specific forms with a precise socio-historical conjuncture. I don't know. In other words, the dialectics of critique is never satisfied with a decontextualized and reified analysis of theory, which is so widespread within the bourgeois humanities. You see, I think I think there's an argument there that needs to be further hashed out, and I'm not sure I get that from his other writings, but maybe it is. Because for example, his stuff on his aesthetics, even though, yes, because he was with Rancière, etc., aesthetics is an important deal. Aesthetics itself is a kind of reified problem. It's a Kantian problem in some ways. Anyway, instead, it always situates people's ideas within the material realm of practice and the social totality. That's a little throwaway. In the case of the Western Marxists, it is important to examine what they said and did, while situating their activities within the overall social relations of intellectual production and global class struggle. and I mean that's its own kind of, dichotomous or bifurcated problem. In order to elucidate the general practical impact of their contributions from the point of view of the primacy of practice, this is the most important issue. That is, Western Marxists have significantly contributed to shoring up the compatible left over and against the socialist alternative, thereby promoting a version of Marxism that is not at all compatible with, capitalism and imperialism. So, shoring up the compatible left over and against socialist alternative, and I do not think that they're easily separated like that, because I think that once you actually see the kind of history, and not the history that he's looking at in particular in this text, where he's putting the Cold War up against, other kinds of things and problems, but that this is part of a much larger kind of problem that we still have today. Anyway, as we've seen, the leading Frankfurt scholars focused on here are, in more ways than one, imperial Marxists. They are, to begin with, a product of the imperial core. They've been bolstered and supported by the imperial superstructure, including both the bourgeois state, where many of them worked for years, and the bourgeois cultural apparatus. What he doesn't do here is really pose what the other thing is that they would have been part of that they weren't part of. It's that always seems problematized, but it is, it happened. It to him, because he's younger, that he didn't have to sort of look at what those crises were as they were happening. So anyway, and their extensive promotion has led to their work being widely consumed by the intellectual labor aristocracy and their comprador allies in the periphery. I think that's such a throwaway idea, but I mean, it's really nice to pose that. It gives you something to denounce people with, I suppose. But I think it's more complicated than that. Situated at the apex of an international pyramid of knowledge production, their writings have been promoted around the globe as some of the most advanced and sophisticated. Yes and no. These objective realities are in part a result of their subjective orientations. With the partial and limited exception of Marcuse in his late phase of radicalization, they have tended to support or at least accommodate imperialism. So, as I said, there is a pejorative component here that, maybe it's merited. I just think that the historical contours need to be worked over a little bit more. Anyway, they've also aggressively fought against the anti-imperialist Marxists and their practical projects of socialist state building. Both objectively and subjectively, they are imperial Marxists. It is crucially important to recognize, moreover, that these two planes are dialectically enmeshed within one another. It is the imperial superstructure that encouraged and cultivated the types of theoretical practices willfully engaged in by the Frankfurt scholars. This is why they have earned a place in the bourgeois pantheon of great thinkers. Well, yes and no. In fact, well, anyway, it is the anti-imperialist Marxist perspective that brings this into view and offers a dialectical and historical materialist account of Western Marxism and its principal function within the objective social world. This approach is more rigorously materialist and dialectical because it does not naively assume, for example, that the Frankfurt School is simply an autonomous theoretical tradition whose ideas have evolved independently of material reality or only within the naturalized parameters of bourgeois historical narratives. Instead, it is a product of the social totality of international class struggle, which needs to be understood to fully elucidate the history of the Institute for Social Research, period. anti-imperialist Marxism, which is ultimately just Marxism in its universal form, just Marxism, at least as it manifests itself in our era, thereby has the distinct advantage of being able to situate the particularity of Western Marxism within the international world war on communism and the history of intellectual imperialism, thereby elucidating its fundamental contributions to the world historical struggle between capitalism and socialism, with, and not to, it's a little either condescending or patronizing in that sense, but, whatever, making an imperial commodity out of Marxism. Now that's the crux of his book, but it's just too easy to dichotomize the argument with imperialism versus anti-imperialism, and it's not to serve as reformist or revisionist or whatever. It's just that I think the historiography is a little more complicated. What is now happening to Marxist theory has, in the course of its history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes and with the object of duping the latter, duping the oppressed classes. So there's a whole other thing going on there. But anyway, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. So, Lenin, is really important in this kind of idea to, address this in a critical kind of way. And it's important to get back to Lenin in that particular way because he's asking those same those kinds of questions. Now, on the other hand, horrible things are happening and other horrible events occur that are integrated with Lenin's history that are kind of underlying, even though we appreciate Lenin's, the volume of Lenin's thought and writings. It was key elements in the overall, trajectory of Marxism. I think that you have to sort of think, well, there's a lot more going on there, and a lot of it does not wind up within the context, for example, of Lenin's collected works. There's a whole set of practices and praxis that gets more complicated, and without going too far into talking about Trotsky and Stalin and all of the other people involved in that couple of decades where it's just problematic relative to socialism in one country, the Great War, the interwar period, World War II, Nazis, all that stuff. The capitalist class and the imperial superstructure have contributed to the development of the commodified version of anti-communist Marxism known as Western or cultural Marxism. It's just too easy to call it that, but we can play along. I just think that under capitalism, there's always a commodified version of anti-communist Marxism. So there's always going to be reactionary elements that oppose each other for good or bad reasons. Althusser versus E.P. Thompson, for example. Severed for the most part from practical, progressive political struggles, it significantly alters some of the fundamental tenets of Marxism in becoming little more than a consumer product of the imperial theory industry. Oh, God, I wish it were so easy to do that. Meaning an ideologically infused commodity for the professional managerial class stratum and the imperial core, and their, I keep, comprador collaborators in the periphery. This is one of the most important features of Western or cultural Marxism, which includes, but also far surpasses the Frankfurt School, and it does do that. By concretely abstracting from specific discourses in order to identify their overall ideological orientation, in spite of some partial exceptions, we can identify additional characteristics. Footnote 3. To begin with, as a theoretical practice, Western Marxism is founded on the primacy of theory rather than practice, and it generally shuns organized progressive politics and repudiates socialist states in favor of engaging in theoretical debates and the analysis of bourgeois cultural products. So, well, anyway, the point for the Western Marxists is not to change the world, not to change the world, but to interpret it, or sometimes even just to interpret texts or other cultural products instead of having to deal with the real world. Now, we can go at great length about that it is purely an interpretive practice. No, I think it's an explanatory practice too, and that I think that those, intellectuals worth their salt usually come to grips with that, and you can it's just not as easy to economize this, but whatever. Their theoretical practice is oriented primarily toward exchange value, not use value, in the sense they are engaged in the symbolic economy of the academic world and the so-called marketplace of ideas, not in a collective practical project of social transformation. Yeah, maybe. I mean, but that sort of comes to the territory. You have uh, bureaucratized bourgeois, petty bourgeois academia, and it just got worse when in the 80s, I think, uh, the imperialism, sort of overtook, at least in the American context, overtook the academy. Why can't, and it still exists. That is, why can't universities be run like businesses? Blah, blah, blah. And, and the reality, of course, that only 20% of the population of academics on any given campus actually engage in this kind of practice, and everyone else is just academically positioned as bourgeois or petty bourgeois, sort of scientists and engineers and et cetera. And the real problematic for in the American context is that there is something called a business school, which is the real problem of the imperial problem of academia. So attacking the humanities or cultural studies or theory in this particular context is a kind of, you know, well, not foolish, but it is not fully addressing, I think, the bigger critique of the institutional or superstructural critique. So anyway, as a result, they're invested in brand management. And their discourses are replete with idiosyncratic conceptual vocabularies, extensive bourgeois cultural references, trendy rhetoric, postmodernism, blah, 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 theoretical obscurantism, and intellectual eclecticism. Well, I think that's a little too pejorative in the sense that all academia does that. It doesn't matter whether it's, science or the humanities or anything in between. That comes to the territory, and it's not about, I don't. I think you circumscribe the argument too closely by choosing to demonize, as it were, Western Marxists. And with all due respect, they should be. But I think that there were and are, because some of them are still alive, trying to work through that problem and are engaged in praxis. And I think you sell them short in that from that perspective. And as I said, it may be only 20% of your faculty, maybe 30%. Is engaged in this kind of theoretical activity, and whereas the rest of the population of academics on any given campus, and it's been shrunk and constrained or enclosed, by the business apparatus of any university, is reactionary or imperial or whatever. And so to kind of identify one kind of ideological position or a set of ideological positions that overgeneralize the problem, noting, of course, that the subset of Marxists in any academic department, particularly in the American context, and you can contrast the American context with, for example, from an Anglo-American point of view, with the British context, as I've said that before, there are just a hell of a lot more Marxists in any department outside of the United States, whereas in the United States, few and far between. Having actually had to put up with this, few and far between. Um, I just think it's scapegoating a section of the discipline, which it's useful for writing, etc. But I think at the historiographic sort of level, the details are a little bit fast and loose. A bigger discussion should be made. Methodologically, Western Marxists are revisionists who attempt to transform some of the fundamental tenets of dialectical and historical materialism, DHM. They generally reject Marxist materialist ontology and the dialectics of nature. This is fast and loose, as I would assert, because I think that it's much more detailed than that. And I think that the dialectics of nature is not fully rejected. I think it's because some people don't sort of fully engage it. And if they did, they would simply not reject it, or I just think they just haven't encountered it. And they focus on cultural criticism at the expense of political economy. And that's too easy a problem as well. It's a kind of overdetermination problem that yes, there are people who do that. They have built entire careers on this. And yes, you can tar the Frankfurt School with the same thing, but not everybody does that. And it's even a smaller, more marginal population. I just don't think it's as pernicious as one could argue for. And yes, there probably are, but whatever. I just think we're getting into that you need the NKVD to sort of work through this, an academic NKVD, and I don't think that you don't need to go that far. This severely limits the scope and depth of their analyses, and there's a widespread tendency to assume that culture and the world of ideas constitute the driving forces of history, not class struggle. And that's the fundamental issue, is to, and I don't mean to say that it's reductionist when you say it. I mean, class struggle is there and does all of this, and by necessity, by culture and the world of ideas is part of this. You can't, that this is to I think limit what counts as people who class consciousness, a whole bunch of other things that are part of DHM that are important elements, and that I would like to see in his work. But maybe he does this, and I just haven't read enough of his work. So that's another thing. This idealism goes hand in hand with utopian rather than scientific socialism. And as you note from our last reading, it's a lot denser than that, this contrast with utopian and scientific stuff. In other words, if they actually defend revolutionary socialism in any form, it is almost exclusively socialism in theory, not in practice. And I think that's an oversimplification. But anyway, the bourgeois idea that only art, culture, or theory can save us, and I don't know of anyone who actually believes that, but that's another one of these kind of overdetermined arguments, not revolutionary class struggle, is one of the, I just don't think that they wouldn't be Marxists anymore if they didn't have a sense of revolutionary class struggle. They would just simply be, the PMC, the bourgeois, the imperialists, and I just don't wouldn't continents that argument, because I don't think they're very good. They aren't very many examples of actually that, from a Marxist point of view. So anyway, it's one of the leitmotifs of their discourse. Yes, it is a leitmotif, but in fact, it is just a leitmotif. The overinflation of the superstructural expresses a self-aggrandizing assessment of the role of professional intellectuals like themselves and reflects their petty bourgeois class standing. Well, not well. Anyway, I think Marx would have something to say, would have interesting things to say about that as well, as does Lenin. Unsurprisingly, given the inability of art and culture to save us, they simultaneously insulate themselves against revolutionary social transformations that would shake the foundations of their class position within the imperial core. Well, yeah. But then again, they're also marginalized within the imperial core relative to even the class position. So I just find that not satisfactory, to make that the argument from that perspective, because I just think it's such a small element. Just in my experience, it's not as big as you'd think. Instead of orienting their readers towards social change, then they indulge in a self-fulfilling prophecy of defeatism, often accompanied by left-wing there's a whole book that could be written there. Left-wing melancholia, where when they do try to identify a political exit to the quagmire of consumer capitalism, which they bemoan and sometimes incisively criticize, they generally engage in third way politics. Now, this is, maybe they're just liberals, meaning the classic petty bourgeois belief that there's a magical third way beyond capitalism and actually existing socialism. I guess some people believe that. And you could probably argue it. It just, I don't find it substantive in terms of making an argument about some sort of imperialist cabal within, the context of academia or even Marxists. But anyway, this can come in the form of a new idea or a messianic opening of the heavens on the one hand, or on the other, in a more terrestrial form, a popular movement or jacquerie that rejects the status quo. Darn hippies. However, they eschew the disciplined forms of hierarchical organization and strategic planning identified with communism. Yeah, perhaps. This helps guarantee that their defeatist convictions will be confirmed. You will never be able to change the world if if you think this only requires a newfangled theory or you're waiting on divine intervention, nor will you. Yeah, see, I think this oversimplifies it, but I find it amusing. I just wonder whether there are actually any academics who actually, Marxist academics who actually do this. Nor will you ever succeed politically if you assume that an unorganized popular revolt can magically win against extremely well-funded, highly organized, and militarized imperialist states with extensive expertise in counterinsurgency. That's the crux of his thing with the CIA, and as well as the most powerful propaganda network in the history of humanity to back them up. After that, yeah, I guess we'd all be defeatist. The specific ideological coordinates of Western Marxism include, first and foremost, a rejection of actually existing socialism. Now, that is the problematic element because, and when you look at the kind of historical things, that is how is it that you cope with this thing called actually existing socialism in the middle and second half of the 20th century? Many Western Marxists are opposed to organized revolutionary politics across the board, which includes the party form and the very idea of seizing state power. If, and the footnote probably is worth bears looking at in this particular context, that is, some Western Marxists support social democracy, usually without a full contextualization of the history of imperialism, the real world socialist alternative, and the role of social democratic class compromises in shoring up imperialism over and against socialism. Tactical support for social democratic reforms within a overall strategy of socialist transformation can, of course, make perfect sense in certain cases, Bernie Sanders, I guess. But this is not the same thing as embracing capitalist and imperialist social democracy as the strategic objective. And this footnote is worth asking Bernie what he thinks of this. I would love to ask him his position on this, because it certainly would clarify a lot of things for me. They're not simply liberals. They tend to be, in practical terms, very close to anarchists. And then this is a whole nother, there's probably a whole thing there. They often fall back on simplistic moralizing approaches that naively advocate for horizontalist democracy and criticize hippies and criticize all forms of domination rather than thinking in politically strategic terms about how to structurally modify society over the long term in order to make democracy truly universal and substantive. I'm beginning to think, at this point in the text, you sort of go, God, we should all be lawyers then, or we should all go to law school. Let's put it that way, because there's other issues that will evolve from bifurcating the position this way. But anyway, they thus end up not to be strategic thinkers who recognize that the dialectics of socialism sometimes require tactics that might appear to contradict the overall goal. Darn those Mensheviks, but are the only way of advancing socialism in the real world. Finally, if given the choice between communism and capitalism, Western Marxists practically side with the latter over and against the former. God, class traitors, whatever. Despite their criticism of capitalism, some of which are well-founded, they tend to be anti-communist capitalist accommodationists. Oh, heavens to Betsy. The overall effect of Western Marxism has been the global promotion of a petty bourgeois cultural commodity with little use value for practical struggles over and against the collective and innovative science of liberation known as DHM. I don't think I would disagree with that. I just think that there's no university in the United States. And it's unfortunate. And even those that are most left in terms of a integrated, heterodox kind of a political economy, and a variety of other things, there's just no place that would endorse or is built on that kind of formation. Whereas I would at least give that to other nation states with university systems that have a little bit more going on in that direction, or at least the tolerance of it. Whereas I think that anti-communism is unfortunately taken the high ground, since the latter has proven its ability to practically transform the world by breaking the chains of imperialism. It's clearly, from the vantage point of the ruling class, the most dangerous theoretical weapon of class struggle, because it's not been able to eradicate it outright. The bourgeoisie has worked with elements of the bourgeois state and the bourgeois cultural apparatus to cultivate a commodified version of Marxism that can spread the virus of anti-communism under the cover of a red-colored pill. Well, I'm sure that there is a grouping of people, and in fact, it may be that the reason why Trumpism has taken over is to actually to pile on that. That's been the problem, and they're paying the price, and we all pay the price for that. This has produced an imperious industry of ineffective academic discourses that are promoted around the globe as the I don't know if they are the vanguard of Marxist theory, but which, practically speaking, serve to misdirect, confuse, or simply alienate those in search of a rigorous theoretical guide to understanding and transforming the world. You know, well, it's sort of interesting. I think I want at this moment to have him name names, so either I can avoid these people or at least challenge their ideological positions, because it gets a little problematic, and maybe that's the case, or there's a kind of politeness that academics tend to have, and that's it's unfortunate, partially because it's a career thing, but those of us who don't have to worry about that or don't worry about that, we can actually speak our minds on the issue. The primary purpose of undertaking an extensive dialectical critique of Western or cultural Marxism, eh, see, even that is uncomfortable, thereby demonstrating that it is ultimately imperial Marxism, has been to provide people with the knowledge necessary for them to orient themselves in the intellectual world war, figure out which side they're on, and advance the most coherent direction, in the most coherent direction. I think everyone does that. Since this has been more of a subtext through the analysis, let us conclude then by indicating that direction by briefly outlining the principal features of anti-imperialist Marxism. And I don't want to go too far here, but I don't think he goes far enough in terms of outline. His outline is that, and I think I wanted. By the time I got to the end of this, I wanted something more, but that's just me. AIM, anti-imperial, and it's not the American Indian movement; it's anti-imperialist Marxism. Even then, there's brand management problem. Anti-imperialist Marxism has not been promoted by the imperial theory industry. I just don't think that there's an imperial theory. I mean, I think that there is a theory industry. I just don't think it's as imperial as he makes it out to be. That's all. I mean, I think it's imperialist, but for sure, but I don't think it functions imperially. That's maybe the historiographic problem I have with this, which has instead demoted and often demonized it, or at least repackaged it to try and make it look like something different. It is oriented first and foremost towards changing the world instead of merely interpreting it. In this regard, it maintains what Lenin referred to as the revolutionary core of Marxism, which revisionists of various stripes have tried to gut. In this sense, anti-imperialist Marxism is Marxism to core, or Marxism in the era of imperialism that is unaltered by those who have tried to eliminate its essence. That there's a lot loaded in there as well. And there's probably whole texts that we could comment on this problem. Attacking the totalizing discourse of Marxism, blah blah blah. It may also be said more generally that whereas Western Marxism is a particular cultural permutation, or yes, perversion, which would best be described as imperial Marxism, indicating both its source and its ideological orientation, the Marxism dedicated to anti-colonial and anti-imperialist emancipation is universal Marxism. I don't think that's controversial, but it is demonized. It's that demonizing thing that kind of makes one uncomfortable. DHM of this sort developed in opposition to the capitalist class and bourgeois states through popular struggles and the fight from below. As Lenin insightfully argued, drawing on Marx, revolutionary politics requires that segments of the bourgeois intelligentsia commit class suicide and ally with the working class, thereby contributing developed forms of scientific analysis that require training and expertise beyond what the working class is generally given access to under capitalism. Agreed. It's why some of us are trying to figure out, the the continuing issues and problems of classical political economy in the context of the much larger kind of problem of value and trying to determine a whole bunch of other things that ultimately become class struggle. However, the class basis of DHM is in the working and oppressed peoples of the world, and particularly those that have been the most exploited in the colonial periphery, not the intellectual labor aristocracy a la imperial. I think that's just it's filled with false dichotomy, but I just don't see it as organized that way. And I mean, in my experience, it's hard to believe that they're so most of the people who are Marxists on faculties, as far as I can tell, are anti-imperial Marxists. Um, Everything else is petty bourgeois, the usual, melange. But I just don't see it as quite so, omniscient or omnipresent. DHM is firmly grounded in the primacy of practice, yes. It is an evolving collective tradition of analyzing and intervening in the world, and it is therefore of necessity a practical process of learning. Rather than exchange value, it is use value that guides it insofar as I think he's making a mistake there. But anyway, it is use value that guides it insofar as it strives to provide the most rigorous, coherent, and in fact, I don't think you can divide it that way if you actually read Marx, particularly in Capital. But anyway, provide the most rigorous, coherent, and systematic understanding of concrete reality and how to change it. What is often fetishized in imperial Marxism is theoretical innovation for its own sake, and practical Marxism is commonly denigrated for being reductivist, dogmatic, orthodox, and so forth. Well, I mean, maybe it's supposed to, with respect, it is problematic to come up against reductivist, dogmatic, and orthodox Marxists because they tend not to be, fully engaged, or they're kind of easily, whatever, angered, I suppose. Although there have been sometimes been elements of this sort operative in particular movements, many of which have been correctly criticized and practically overcome by anti-imperialist Marxists, the expansive international history of dialectical and historical materialism, DHM, has been one characterized by significant innovations, impressive levels of creativity, highly refined and dialectical analyses, extremely perceptive strategic and tactical calculations, savvy practical solutions, and in general, a successful charting of uncharted territory. One would love to that's kind of what one does. But, I just, whatever. This does not mean that there have not been major mistakes and setbacks. Yes, indeed, as well as conflicts and disagreements. The path to developing socialism in the real world has been torturous and complicated, to say the least. However, this is the price one has to pay if you're not operating in the purportedly pristine world of pure ideas. Note that our little book on subsumption is talking about a pristine world that only exists in a kind of dialectical subsumptive relation, and is fully, it needs exchange value and to get it to work properly. Anyway, when you are developing socialism in the real world, you are tasked with creating something that has never existed before, and you have to do it under conditions of constant imperialist aggression. Yeah. There has never been a single instance where socialism has been allowed to develop on its own. That's kind of a tautology, but anyway, we have only known socialism under siege, as Michael Parenti emphasized, never socialism set free. This has meant that socialists have had to be extremely innovative and open to an ongoing process of practical readjustment, as well as, when necessary, honest and humble self-critique. It may be impossible to have both honest self-critique and humble self-critique at the same time. But anyway, And the moment that, or the dialectical difference, in fact, between self-critique and self-criticism, because that even posing it as that is problematized. Anyway, is commodified in fact. Let us cite a few examples using the names of individuals, the full recognition of their figures who embody the collective struggle of the masses. Indeed. Lenin is such a titan in the world socialist movement, not only because he led the first successful socialist revolution, but also because he situated the anti-imperialist struggle at the very heart of socialist state building projects by recognizing that the class struggle in an imperialist world primarily takes the form of a national struggle of liberation from imperialism. That's all true, but you still have to, the practice is still, important. And particularly and if you're going to talk about Lenin, you have to talk about, a kind of modernization or industrialization that is also kind of working itself, within the context of class struggle. So I just think, anyway, national struggles of liberation from imperialism, therefore, are not always about uh, uh, or do not adequately address technology. Let's put it that way. Drawing on Lenin, Mao Zedong adapted this lesson from imperialism. No, Mao Zedong adapted this lesson and others to the specificities of underdeveloped agrarian China with its large peasant population. I think that's really shortchanging everything in one sentence, but that, because I think it's much more complicated than that. Greatly Forward, 1956, a whole bunch of other things that are um, engaging the problem of the peasantry, or the reality of the peasantry. Ho Chi Minh incorporated Lenin's insights into the liberation struggle in Vietnam, which was woefully underdeveloped by colonialism and then became a major target of imperialist warfare for decades, bringing a whole series of additional problems that needed to be dealt with through a protracted people's war. No argument there. Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara drew on these lessons and others, because it does go back to Lenin in that particular sense, although People's War is a whole nother thing. But anyway, drew on these lessons and others to engage in guerrilla warfare, organize the peasantry, and bring socialism to the Western Hemisphere on an island just 90 miles from the U.S. empire. Thomas Sankara, operating in a very different context, organized radical elements of the military to a coordinated takeover of the state in Upper Volta, backed by a popular uprising. This is, there's a whole nother set of things that need to be argued in that case as well. In all of these cases, and many more that could be cited, there is not a blueprint for revolution or an orthodox doctrine to be applied. Instead, there was a rich collective tradition that provided a holistic worldview and an archive of experience to draw on, but everything concrete needed to be invented in each case and adapted to new and changing situations. Innovation was of the essence, but not for its own sake. He really hates that idea, or in a theoretical vacuum, but rather to solve practical problems and chart new territory. This is the real task of DHM, to construct a new world out of the ruins of the old. This is what we were looking at before in the prior text on in terms of principal contradiction. The practical orientation of DHM has led to a refined understanding of the relationship between tactics and strategy in what we can refer to as the dialectics of socialism, footnote 6. Lenin provided one of the most succinct and insightful metaphors for understanding it. He described a scene, and I like the metaphor here because I think it does describe the principal contradiction stuff that we're looking at in the prior text, and because that's kind of what this, from a dialectical point of view, it's kind of what you're doing. A scene in which a mountain climber seeking to access a summit that had never before been attained, was, quote, forced to turn back, descend, seek another path, longer perhaps, but one that would enable him to reach the summit, close quote. Footnote 7. At a safe distance, people below watched his movement through a telescope and maligned him for failing to attain his goal. Some gleefully celebrated his lack of success and denounced him as a lunatic, hoping he would fall, whereas others concealed the joy and feigned sorrow over the fact that the poor soul had not awaited the completion of their well-thought-out plan for scaling the mountain. They all agreed, however, that what they saw before their eyes was a clear case of failure. This is that 3 steps forward, 2 steps back sort of idea, I suppose. The onlookers in this metaphor rely on sense perception. There's a whole nother set of philosophical issues there. Rely on sense perception to arrive at their conclusion. What they saw was a mountain climber turning back from the summit and descending. What they lacked was understanding, since the climber could not advance on the chosen path. The only possible way of making it to the summit was to descend and find another way forward. This text was written 11 months after the promulgation of the new economic policy in March 1921, which temporarily introduced a free market and capitalism, both subject to state control. Footnote 8. And that's a whole history that needs to be fully explicated and seen as problematized, and then Lenin gets shot, and then Stalin, manipulates the situation and as heir to the throne or whatever, and it gets all screwed up. As becomes clear in the final paragraph of Lenin's article, the climber he describes was a metaphorical representation of the Soviets who had enacted the new economic policy, first 5-year plan, blah, 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 which Lenin described as our retreat, our descent. Footnote 9. The leader of the Russian Revolution thereby provided us with a metaphorical depiction of the dialectics of socialism. What appears to sense perception as a step backward is, at the level of the understanding, simply a necessary maneuver in order to successfully advance towards the overall objective. And you can see how Mao picks up on this and applies it to, practices that would be more largely open to peasants in that sense. Anyway, sense perception is the lowest level of socialist consciousness. It simply consists in looking at the world and comparing it to a picture in one's mind. You see, that's Lenin right there. That's the Leninist perception theory at work. Regardless of whether it's inverted in the optical sense or not in the, Euclidean sense, without necessarily understanding the nature of the world or the struggles at hand. This reductive approach is characteristic of imperial and imperious Marxists, and their analysis of socialism usually consists in comparing a preconceived image of socialism or communism to what they perceive in the world, which is powerfully mediated by the ideological propaganda that they consume via the bourgeois media and academic world. You see, there's an effects argument here, or a linearity, and as I said, the Lenin, theory of perception at work, which all very interesting, but perception is more than that. Or in fact, if you want to really get to the technical level, it's much more diverse or integrated, or it's just much more complicated. It's the problem of the cognitive cognitive theory at that level. And yes, it's I think it's important to understand how that works, because I think that's what trickles down to a lot of people's the problematics of practice. But anyway, the dialectic of socialism requires that one moves to the higher level of understanding, which necessitates making a clear distinction between tactics and strategy. Tactics are the short-term maneuvers necessary to advance towards a strategy or the ultimate goal. Now, that's one way of looking at the relation between tactics and strategy, and I think there are a variety of others, and that Lenin actually believes in. Or anyway, as Lenin made clear, tactics sometimes appear to contradict the strategy. After all, if someone sees a mountain climber descending, why would they assume that this is a tactic for attaining the summit? In the same manner, if someone perceives socialist countries that introduce market elements under state control in order to foster necessary development, why would they think that this is the path to communism? The answer is to be found at a higher level of socialist consciousness than sense perception. At this level, and this level thing is actually interesting as well. It becomes clear that the material nature of the world is such that certain tactics, which appear to amateur eyes, as opposed to professional eyes, I suppose, to be forms of retreat, are actually necessary steps backward in order to make leaps forward. The faster, and this leap forward obviously has other implications. The faster socialist countries can establish their sovereignty and develop their productive forces, the quicker they are going to be able to, if they stay on the socialist path, move to the next level and work through these contradictions because they are no longer simply struggling for survival. This does not mean that one has to simply accept any and all tactics that wave the flag of socialism. It's important in this regard that social struggle continues under socialism and that socialist projects have engaged in different tactics for dealing with imperialism and responded to the need to develop. We can and should critically assess the relative successes or failures of specific tactics, which is part of the ongoing collective process of practical learning. And this is the moment where you sort of say, well, maybe we need to look at Paulo Freire or whatever and rethink about what learning means in that context. The apex of socialist consciousness is not understanding, but applied practical reason or praxis, which goes hand in hand, of course, with the recognition that practice is the ultimate arbiter of truth. This is what will clarify what works or does not. In the case of the mountain climber, did his apparent descent lead to his practical success in scaling the mountain, or at least making it to the next plateau? In the case of socialism, have these apparent steps backward allowed socialist countries to advance toward the strategy over time, even if it takes decades? If not, what can be learned from this backtracking, and what other viable paths forward exist? There are no perfect blueprints for producing socialism. There's only an archive of experience and a practical process of learning that advances in part through trial and error. This is one of the reasons why that is so important for socialists to learn from their mistakes or those of others in order to collectively figure out how best to scale the mountain, thereby accomplishing practical tasks that have never been done before. Now, for such a gargantuan undertaking, the holistic, scientific, innovative, and practically oriented approach of DHM is necessary. Indeed. By contrast, and this, you can argue whether this is easily divided, imperial Marxism has remained woefully underdeveloped. It lacks practical knowledge of how to build socialism, does not grasp the dialectics, and it does not grasp the dialectics of development. Instead, it traffics in the most simplistic and reductivist accounts of actually existing social. I don't think that they do that. Or, I just think it's a straw argument. But anyway, ideologically conditioned theoretical assumptions, it remains duped, moreover, by the propaganda pumped out by the imperial superstructure. The two to which it makes its own academic contributions. So at some moment, you're co-opted, I guess. And the issue, of course, as I've just argued, is, how many people are duped, or, you know, does this also winnow out actual, DHM Marxists or whatever? Anyway, the choice between the two is stark because DHM leads to the difficult collective project of building the preliminary forms of socialism out of the ruins of capitalism. So we never even get that far, I would assert. Whereas imperial Marxism seeks to reinforce these ruins, thereby consolidating the class standing of those intellectuals supported by them while attacking those on the other path. And anyway, class struggle in theory is so polarized because these two positions are ultimately grounded in two different practical orientations in a historical conjuncture where the stakes of class struggle are arguably higher than at any point in history. As discussed in the introduction to this book, imperialism has driven us to the age of exterminism. Imperialism has driven us to the age of exterminism, where it is now undeniable that its continuation will lead to the end of humanity and possibly the entire biosphere. And this is an interesting problem. I mean, anyway, if human beings and life on Earth are to have a future, it's necessary to develop a socioeconomic system that breaks with the one that is leading to annihilation, which is the one that is ultimately supported by imperial Marxism. There is no doubt that this is an extremely difficult task, one that requires heightened levels of creativity, intelligence, hard work, practical ingenuity, self-critique, sacrifice, humility, collaboration, strategic thinking, and much more. Everyone has their role to play, wherever they are in the world, and whatever contributions they want to be able to make, regardless of how large or small. It is the greatest struggle of our times, for it is the fight for our collective future. We're all situated in it, whether we choose to be or not, and we do need to bring as many people over to our side as possible if we're going to win. The intellectual world war is but one of the skirmishes in this overall class struggle for the future of the world and for the path of humanity's development, or not, on planet Earth. Nevertheless, it's extremely important because its outcome determines the horizons of people's consciousness and how they orient themselves in the world. Indeed, if one conclusion can be drawn from this book, it is that in relation to the commodified forms of Marxism promoted by the imperial superstructure, we have nothing but our intellectual chains to lose, and we have a world to win. Indeed. It is ultimately the problem that we have to come back to this issue of what are the commodified forms of Marxism promoted by the imperial superstructure, and how easy are they to identify? Why have we been bamboozled by these things? That's a whole nother thing that needs to be sort of worked through. And not having read enough of Rockhill's work, I assume he sort of works through that. And I've included the introduction to his book on art to sort of get to that problem. Although I think it's the same logical argument where he kind of bifurcates art and politics as though you could, you either assume that they're together or they're against each other or something. It's an arbitrary construction, and I think problematic, although the way he goes about it, of course, is an interesting idea and certainly one worth discussing. And I would assert there are other ways to discuss this that are very consonant with what he looks at. But I would also assert that it doesn't fully engage the quote unquote from the sociological side, the art world, and that the micro politics, as it were, um, is also problematized relative to official or dominant or imperialist art. So just to use his terminology. So I would assert that that's another problem. So anyway, worth talking about. So I included the kind of duck version of Rockhill, and you can see that he's the paying the piper had a sort of front end called Western Marxism: How It Was Born, How It Died, How It Can Be Reborn. And so it is, it opens the argument, and then he kind of reinforces it because of this trove of CIA stuff that he's worked through. So anyway, that's the thing. Um, and so there are methodological stuff that's important. Obviously, the historic, radical history, and the AI kind of does it as a generic kind of thing. And we may look at, and I haven't quite decided, because maybe we'll look at something else, or maybe the Western Marxism book by him may give us a better answer, because I think he sort of has built that argument into the Piper book, but I maybe it's better fleshed out in that book. So need to more reading. Radical history and the politics of art, and I'm not sure about this one as well. Partially because I think he's making certain arguments, the reasonable arguments. I mean, realism, formalism, commitment, three historic positions on art and politics, for example. Um, the commitment question is probably even more important than the realism or formalism question. But anyway, visions of the avant-garde, theoretical destiny of the avant-garde, reconsideration of avant-garde practices, and it's important to consider that, particularly since most art or avant-garde eventually becomes a arrière-garde or rear guard, and that most of our actions are unfortunately rear guard actions, um, ultimately, and particularly in a political point of view. But we can see where he's headed because, of course, he studied with Rancière. Uh, so anyway, Silent Revolution, which I think is also an interesting set of, when you look at Rancière talk about this, that his engagement is actually quite useful and interesting in trying to work through that. But on the other hand, it is this problem of what counts as aesthetics, which even posing it in and of itself has another set of issues. But anyway, and of course the social politicity, the politicity of the arts, the social politicity of aesthetic practices, the politicity of apolitical art, a pragmatic intervention in art of the Cold War, which I think, is interesting because it sort of fits in his same issue with, the CIA and the Frankfurt School, etc. Rethinking the politics of aesthetic practices, advancing the critique of the ontological illusion and the talisman complex. See, there, I think he's actually, to talk about it in that way is to actually engage in the commodity, approach to ideas. But anyway, so we'll perhaps look at the introduction, though. I think it kind of winds around, and I'm not sure that it quite gets to where it needs to go. But then again, Columbia published it, so whatever. Anyway, so I got to the end of this, and hopefully have either looked at this in little bunches and can sort of work through this. We'll talk more in the next installment, but we've at least gotten through the entire conclusion to the Paying the Piper of Volume 1. And anyway, share is wait a second.